Cotton, the wealth of America's southern states. Cotton, the catalyst for secession and the Civil War. Cotton, white fortunes created by African-American slaves. Cotton, the heart of Britain's Industrial Revolution. Then in 1861, the American Civil War started. American cotton ceased to be exported. Britain lost 80% of its supply. Cotton feast became cotton famine. Meanwhile, Britain supplied arms to both sides and abhorred slavery in principle while profiting from it in practice. Now a new book reveals the full effect of the war on Britain's cotton trade. Losing the Thread: Cotton, Liverpool, and the American Civil War.
When I graduated in 1971, I little thought that academic research would have a place in my future life. But decades later, I found out about the role of two ancestors in Britain's cotton trade during the American Civil War. That war had a devastating effect on British cotton. When I discovered that there hadn't been any full-length academic work on the subject, I applied to study for a doctoral thesis at the University of Liverpool. Liverpool University Press has now published a book based on the thesis, and I'm making two films which describe the book. This second film covers the interaction between Britain and America during the conflict. The first film covered the impact of the American Civil War on the British cotton trade. In these films, I discuss the book and its main themes with Meredith Wheeler, for many years a writer-producer for ABC News in New York and London. Meredith comes at the subject from an American perspective, while the book approaches it from a British perspective. I hope we will come together somewhere in the mid-Atlantic. Hello, Meredith.
Hi, Jim. Just to get an overview, how much of your book would you say concerns Britain during the American Civil War, and how much concerns the United States?
You can't really separate the two. As Brian Shern has written, without cotton and the international demand for it, there would not have been secession or a civil war. There was an unbroken umbilical cord that bound the two countries together, and that cord was woven from cotton. The narrative may mostly be about Britain, but standing silently behind every page is America. It is a constant presence. The book is primarily about the British cotton trade during the war, but what most influenced that trade was events in America, while events in America were influenced in turn by reactions in Britain. I would go further and say that you can't fully comprehend the Civil War without understanding its British dimension. The war was not only about the battles, it was about the political and economic background to the conflict, and that, to a large extent, revolved around cotton.
There was anger at Britain's neutrality during the American Civil War. It didn't side with either the North or the South. Can you expand upon that?
Both sides wanted, and perhaps expected, Britain's unequivocal support. The British Prime Minister, Lord Palmerston, put it aptly when he said that the two sides each felt some little stinging resentment on account of that neutrality which they both of them, in some degree, characterized as unfriendliness. Britain did remain officially neutral during the war, but neutrality meant something different to Britain than to either side in America. Also, there certainly was unfriendliness in Britain towards both sides. It is generally felt by historians, and I agree, that a majority in Britain favoured the Union. However, many people dislike both sides. They dislike the South principally because of slavery. They dislike the North for a number of reasons. the hostility towards Britain of the New York press, the Union's designs on Canada, its opposition to free trade, the fact that America was Republican and anti-monarchist, many reasons. However, a neutral Britain still wielded considerable influence on events in America.
How did that influence manifest itself?
Most obviously on the Confederate side, and most immediately in the response to the King Cotton strategy. The South believed that Britain was so economically dependent on its cotton that it would be forced to recognize the Confederacy as an independent nation. In June 1861, the Charleston Mercury declared that the cards are in our hands and we intend to play them out to the bankruptcy of every cotton factory in Great Britain and France, or the acknowledgement of our independence. Jefferson Davis regarded British recognition as an assumed fact. Without that assumption, secession and the Civil War may never have happened.
And why did Britain never recognize the Confederacy? And indeed, why did the leaders in the South ever think that they would?
The economies of the southern states were wholly dependent on cotton. There was little industry and almost no commercial infrastructure. In 1860, 85% of America's chartered banks were in the North and 90% of its industrial output. As a result, much of the South's cotton income ended up in the hands of northern banks and merchants, which was one of the main grievances of the South before secession. The mistake made by Confederate leaders was to believe that their dependence on cotton was mirrored in Britain. They were encouraged in this belief by the British cotton trade and by the politicians associated with them. Henry Ashworth, a major mill owner, told a meeting that the entire failure of a cotton crop, should it ever occur, would utterly destroy and perhaps forever all the manufacturing prosperity we possess.
Was Henry Ashworth overstating the case?
Yes, just a bit. Cotton may have been by far the most important industry in Britain at the time, but it was by no means the only one. Britain was economically diverse, unlike the Confederacy. 16% of the population may have been dependent on cotton for its income, but that meant that 84% was not. And this 84% was doing extremely well in the 1860s. So from an economic viewpoint, there was no compelling reason for Britain to recognize the Confederacy. And although the issue was much discussed, there was no compelling political reason either, not least because of the depth of British hostility to slavery.
Is it true that the South misjudged the timing of this cotton strategy, and that in fact they'd grown too much cotton before the war, so there was a glut, which undermined their influence over Britain's policies?
No, that isn't true. And there has been a parallel argument in Britain, with historians claiming that British mills produced far too many cotton goods in the 3 years before the war. Put together, the allegation is of a glut of both raw cotton and cotton goods on the eve of the war. I have analysed this allegation in forensic detail, and it is utterly untrue. All the evidence shows that before the war, both the supply of raw cotton and the manufacture of cotton goods was broadly in line with international demand.
You've touched upon the British hostility to slavery. Let's just remind ourselves that the British abolished the Atlantic slave trade in about 1807, and by 1834 freed all the slaves in most of the British colonies. So the American Civil War over slavery was happening about 30 years after that. So for decades, after slavery had been abolished in Britain, England was still buying cotton produced almost entirely by slaves. Was there any concern about that in Britain?
Yes and no. Almost everyone in the cotton trade and almost everyone in Britain was implacably opposed to slavery in principle. But in practice, it was a different matter. Eugene Dattel has written that most New Yorkers did not care that the cotton was produced by slaves because for them it became sanitized once it left the plantation. For New Yorkers, one could read Britons. The degree of hypocrisy and moral disconnection within Britain and the British cotton trade was extraordinary. Slavery was evil, but eliminating it in America was someone else's problem to be achieved at some undefined future point. The vast wealth that Britain as a country and mill owners as individuals accumulated from cotton was knowingly built on the back of American slave labor. And hardly anyone was unduly bothered by this in practice.
During the Civil War, Britain seized the opportunity to trade with both sides, didn't it? Selling weapons to both the North and the South.
Yes, this was the heyday of laissez-faire economics. If someone overseas wanted to buy arms from Britain, then Britain sold them arms. Moral principles didn't enter into it, and the British government mostly didn't intervene. The most notorious contribution made by Merseyside to the Confederacy was to its navy, non-existent at the start of the war and the scourge of the Union by its end. The ravages to Union shipping wrought by the Florida and the Alabama, both built on Merseyside, were devastating. Britain also supplied the Confederacy with huge quantities of small arms and ammunition.
Did the famous Union blockades of southern ports have much impact on the Atlantic cotton trade? And for that matter, how important was blockade running as an activity?
From a British perspective, blockade running was of negligible importance. During the war, it accounted for less than 1% of the Port of Liverpool's trade. And the cotton received in exchange for the armaments shipped to the South had almost nil impact on Britain's cotton scarcity. However, from a Confederate perspective, blockade running was vital. Without the arms and supplies that the trade provided, the South could not have sustained the war.
The only association most Americans have with Liverpool now is with the Beatles. But back in the day, it had a reputation of siding with the South. Is that warranted?
No, it was a lot more nuanced than that. There was a great deal of support for the Confederacy in Liverpool, but also a great deal of support for the Union. It must be remembered that 3/4 of Liverpool's American trade pre-war was with the North, and during the war, virtually all of it. Liverpool had considerable vested interests in the northern states. Also, in terms of small arms and ammunition, Britain actually did more to supply the North than the South. In 1862, Liverpool sent almost 200,000 firearms and nearly 12 million percussion caps to New York. And at the instigation of US Navy Secretary Gideon Welles, Laird Brothers, the Merseyside firm that built the Alabama, was approached to build warships for the Union and agreed to do so, although the ships were never built. This is detailed in the book, using new and original research. The crucial difference was that as the war went on, manufacturers in the northern states converted to arms production, so the Union gradually became far less dependent on British arms than the Confederacy.
And what happened at the end of the Civil War with the abolition of slavery? How did that impact the vital cotton trade?
When the war ended, the freedmen urgently needed to find paid work. For most in the South, the only option was to continue growing cotton. As a result, too much cotton was grown and prices tumbled. The dollar return of each acre under cotton cultivation reduced by 75% between 1869 and 1896. This made it impossible for many cotton farmers to earn a living. It was not so much a failure of free labour as a catastrophic failure of the free market. Over time, most of the South's cotton farmers, both African Americans and whites, incurred substantial debts and became dependent on the credit merchants. Collectively, the southern states had a near monopoly of the supply of raw cotton to the world market. But collectively, the South had no meaning. It existed only as an assortment of desperately poor individuals with no means of using their combined power to raise prices. The simplest way of viewing the Southern cotton economy in the decades after the Civil War is as a vast system of payday loans, with the difference that the payday came only once a year and was often insufficient to pay the loan.
And how did the British cotton trade react to that situation?
It didn't. All it had ever cared about was obtaining a large volume of raw cotton at a low price. How this was achieved had been a matter of indifference under slavery, and it remained a matter of indifference after slavery.
So, a tumultuous period of history, and one that may now be a little better understood. Thanks for talking about your book, Jim.
Thank you too, Meredith. Cheers.
Cheers.